Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show that gives you the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed.
Hello again.
Today, we are not just wading into the shallow end. We are taking a massive intellectual inventory of how the mind works,
That's right.
how the brain calculates, and how culture, shapes everything in between.
And we're doing something pretty specific today. We're drawing entirely from one of the foundational source texts of the discipline, the MIT Encyclopedia of the Cognitive Sciences.
Okay.
Our mission is, well, it's incredibly specific. We're going to do a deep dive on every crucial entry in the entire C section.
Okay, let's unpack this because that might sound a little like we're just reading a dictionary. But the amazing thing about the letter C, you see, is that it covers the core pillars of the entire field. It forces you to connect things that might seem totally separate.
Exactly. It's a perfect map of how multidisciplinary cognitive science really is.
Yeah.
So we'll start with computation and AI. We'll be defining the very limits of what thought can even achieve, looking at big ideas like the Church-Turing thesis and case-based reasoning.
And then we look inside the machine itself, right, into the physical mechanisms with neuroscience.
Yep. Learning about the foundation that Cajal laid and the nitty-gritty of how we learn through conditioning in the brain.
And then we grapple with the internal architecture, the stuff that makes us, well, us. So psychology and linguistics.
How we form concepts, why categorization is so important, how language is structured with something called categorial grammar, and even how languages like Creoles can just, spontaneously appear.
And finally, and this is maybe the most important part, we look at the role of context and society, culture.
Yes. We'll analyze entries like cognitive anthropology, cultural evolution, and cooperation, and really challenge that assumption that the mind just exists in a vacuum.
So we'll define each term, explain its core theory in plain language, and then immediately explore why it matters, giving you this powerful systematic understanding of this whole section of cognitive science.
That's the plan.
All right, let's start at the beginning. Not alphabetically, but chronologically, with the man who first really showed us what our brains are physically made of, Santiago Ramón y Cajal.
To really get Cajal's impact, you have to rewind. Way back to the middle of the 19th century.
Okay.
The nervous system was a genuine mystery. Scientists knew nerves were there, but the actual tiny fundamental elements, the neurons, they were pretty much invisible.
So connections were just guesswork?
Pure speculation.
Yeah.
There was this huge debate about whether nerve fibers were distinct little things or if they just sort of grew out of the gray matter, which would mean the brain was just one continuous soup.
So we have the big picture, the gross structure, but no clue about the building blocks. You can't really have a theory of information flow like that.
You can't. And then in 1873, it was like someone flipped on the lights. Camillo Golgi developed his silver staining method.
The reazione nero, the black reaction.
That's the one. And this technique, it was amazing. It stained a small, random percentage of neurons, but it stained them in their entirety. You could suddenly see the cell body, the soma, all the elaborate dendrites, the long axon, all with stunning clarity.
And this is where that famous intellectual rivalry kicks in, right? Because Golgi and Cajal, they shared the Nobel Prize in 1906, but their ideas about the nervous system were complete opposites.
Total opposites. It's one of the great ironies in science. Golgi won for developing the technique, but Cajal shared the prize for his, quote, masterful interpretations of those very same preparations.
So what was the disagreement?
Well, Cajal was absolutely convinced, based on his incredibly precise drawings, that neurons were discrete, individual cells. This idea became the neuron doctrine.
Golgi disagreed.
Golgi maintained that they formed a continuous interconnected web. A particular theory. He thought it was all one big network.
But Cajal's doctrine, the idea that the nervous system is made of individual cells, that's the one that won out. Why is that so foundational for cognitive science?
Because it established the particulate foundation. All of modern neuroscience, and crucially, all computational modeling of the brain, is built on that idea.
Right.
If the brain were a soup, how would you route information? But if it's made of discrete units that connect at specific points, at synapses, now you have a network.
And now you can actually model it.
Now you can model it. You can talk about signals, input, output, transmission, the core language of information processing.
Okay, so moving from those physical foundations to the functional, let's talk about a really powerful style of human thought that gets modeled a lot in AI, case-based reasoning and analogy, or CBR.
CBR is a system design style where your decision-making, your action in a new situation, is guided by recalling and applying A single, distinctive prior case.
A precedent.
A precedent, a prototype, an episode from memory. It's an approach to problem solving that doesn't need a huge list of general rules.
So what's the radical idea there compared to, say, traditional machine learning?
Well, traditional induction tries to pull out general rules from a huge pile of data right away. CBR, on the other hand, postpones induction.
It postpones it.
Yeah, instead of just throwing away all the specifics to get a general rule, it keeps the raw, really nuanced individual cases available for later.
I can see the advantage there. If your general rule fails, you haven't lost the weird exceptions. But what's the logical problem with relying on just one single case?
And that's where the scruffy association comes from. It's inspired directly by psychology. Roger Schenck called cases memories and retrieval remindings. But philosophically, you run smack into what Stuart Russell called the logical problem of analogy. Which is basically, when is one single example enough to justify a rule?
And what was Russell's answer to that?
He proposed this idea of determinations. These are relations that exist out in the world that let a single case basically skew the entire reference class.
Okay, give me an example.
So if you know that nationality determines the language someone speaks, then seeing one Italian person speak Italian is really, really informative. It lets you project a rule.
But seeing one Italian person who's married tells you nothing about all Italians.
Exactly, because nationality doesn't determine marital status. So analogy isn't always a fallacy, but it has to leverage this higher order knowledge, the determination, to work properly.
Let's ground this with an actual application. Tell us about that persuader system.
Kate-Sakar's persuader was an early CBR system. It was designed to reason about these really complex labor management negotiations. And the critical thing is, it didn't use a fixed set of economic laws.
So what did it do?
When it faced a new negotiation, say wage dispute, it would compare features, wage rates, market competition, that sort of thing, to past successful agreements between similar parties.
So it's reasoning by precedent, like a lawyer would.
Just like a lawyer. It would then transform or, numerically scale the terms of those past successful deals to generate a proposal for the current one.
Fascinating. It's a blend of that single case reasoning with this abstract idea of determination.
That's right.
Okay, let's pivot pretty hard now into language structure with categorial grammar, or CG.
Categorial grammar is a group of theories in syntax and semantics where the lexicon, basically the vocabulary, is doing most of the work in defining the syntactic form.
So it's a lexicalized theory.
It's a classic lexicalized theory, just like head-driven phrase structure grammar.
So instead of having these abstract universal rules about phrase structures telling words how to combine, the rules are actually tied to the individual words themselves in your mental dictionary.
Exactly. Each word carries its own category. A noun is N, the sentence is S. And the rules are all about how these categories can combine. So a transitive verb might be defined as something that needs a noun to its right to make a phrase that then needs a noun to its left to make a sentence.
And this reliance on the lexicon gives it some computational advantages.
It gives it a lot of flexibility.
You mentioned that these flexible CGs are really good at handling coordination phenomena, things that traditional grammars have a hard time with. Why is that?
Well, traditional grammars, which are often based on these very rigid phrase structure rules, they demand that anything you coordinate has to be a standard, complete constituent, a noun phrase, a verb phrase, a full sentence.
But that's not how people really talk.
Not at all. People coordinate non-standard fragments all the time, and that breaks the rules of constituent structure.
Can you use that example from the source again? I dislike, but Dexter thinks that Warren likes these flowers.
Yes, that's a perfect one. In that sentence, the two fragments you're coordinating are I dislike and Dexter thinks that Warren likes.
And neither of those is a complete standard unit.
In a standard phrase structure tree, neither of them forms a well-defined constituent of the same type. But because flexible CGs put the rules in the words themselves, they can treat those fragments as, dynamic intermediate units that can combine just fine.
So the grammar actually follows the reality of natural speech.
Exactly. It can handle the kinds of fragments that are common in real conversation, the kind often marked by intonation.
We use language to talk about the world, and to do that, we have to organize the world into these mental bins, which brings us to categorization. Now, if we move past the simple idea that categories are just lists of features, what's the deeper organizing force here?
Well, that takes us right into the competing idea, the theory-based view of concepts. This was championed by researchers like Susan Carey and Frank Keel, and they argued that categorization isn't just about measuring similarity based on surface feature.
It's about something deeper.
It's about concepts being mental representations that are embedded in these larger cognitive structures, what you and I would just call our theories about how the world works.
So these underlying principles, which are often causal, are what determine what's relevant.
Precisely. A theory-based view argues that these deep principles tell you which features matter and how they all relate to each other.
So if your theory of what a bird is involves flight and eggs,
Right. Then the feature has wings is incredibly relevant. But the feature is sitting on my car is totally irrelevant, even if you happen to observe it all the time.
similarity alone can't tell the difference between those two features.
No, only the underlying theory can. And that means concepts are much more than just simple classification procedures.
This distinction immediately leads us to the problem of how we even get that deep knowledge, which is the problem of causal induction.
And this is David Hume's famous philosophical problem, but applied to psychology. You see, causal relations they're not explicit in what we see. You don't see the cause itself.
You just see events happening in sequence.
Exactly. You see observable, non-causal events. So the fundamental question is, how does a human reasoner map those observable inputs to the output of a causal relationship?
The sources outline three major approaches psychology has taken on this. Let's start with the simplest one, regularity solutions.
Regularity solutions focus purely on observing constant conjunctions. X always happens, then Y always happens.
But they're incomplete.
Profoundly incomplete. They can't explain why, for instance, we feel more certain about a cause when we control for other alternatives, or why simple coincidences don't always feel causal.
Okay, then we have power theories. These seem to just skip the whole induction problem by assuming we can perceive the mechanism.
Right. Power theories reject regularity. They argue that we infer causality because we perceive or already know about a causal mechanism or some inherent power.
Like knowing a hammer has the power to break glass.
Exactly. Or that heat has the power to melt ice. But as you said, this kind of begs Hume's original question. How did you acquire that causal knowledge? That the hammer has that power in the first place. If you start with causal knowledge, you haven't solved the problem of induction.
Which brings us to the third one, the Kant-influenced new power approach. How does this try to synthesize things?
This approach assumes we have an a priori and innate general notion that causes just have the power to produce or prevent effects.
So it's a built-in assumption.
It's a built-in assumption that helps the reasoner figure out if an observed regularity is actually causal or just a coincidence. And this framework is very active today because it connects directly to modern computational methods, specifically Bayesian networks. These networks are mathematical models of how humans can infer entire causal structures from just patterns of probabilities. They formalize that inherent structure we assume is there when we look at the world.
That philosophical frame moves us naturally to the philosophy of causation, which asks these broader metaphysical questions about the reality of cause and effect.
Correct. Metaphysically, the big question is, are causal facts reductionist? Can they be boiled down entirely to non-causal facts like Hume wanted? Or are they realist? Are they basic, unanalyzable facts about the world that maybe we can even directly observe?
And since Hume, reductionism has been dominant, and that's led to a few specific definitions of what a cause is. Let's run through them.
Okay, first you have law-based approaches. These define causation using necessary and sufficient conditions that are derived from the general laws of nature. Second is counterfactual analysis, which uses those what-if statements. The cause is defined by saying, if X had not occurred, then Y would not have occurred.
And third.
And third are probabilistic accounts, which just say a cause is something that makes the effect more likely.
It sounds like each one is trying to avoid that sticky idea of power. But what are the major objections that have really plagued all of these reductionist accounts?
There are two really serious ones. First, they all have a hard time accounting for the direction of causation. Why does A cause B and not the other way around?
Right.
Reductionists often have to rely on non-causal features, like the arrow of time or increasing entropy, which kind of weakens their own claim.
And the second objection?
They struggle with the fact that our causal beliefs are often based on really sophisticated statistical information that is itself non-causal. For example, probabilistic accounts have a really tough time in a purely deterministic universe.
Which leads to a strange conclusion.
A very counterintuitive one, that if the universe were perfectly predictable, there wouldn't actually be any distinct causal events within it.
Shifting gears to a domain where prediction and knowledge are everything, let's look at the psychology of chess. This was really the original testing ground for studying human expertise.
It really was. It was perfect.
Yep.
You have a well-defined task, an objective ranking system with the ELO rating, and it was this amazing ground for cross-fertilization with early AI research.
And the classic finding from Adrian de Groot's studies was completely counterintuitive, especially for the computer scientists at the time.
Oh, completely. De Groot found that world-class grandmasters do not use more brute force. They don't search more positions, and they don't search deeper into the game tree than weaker experts.
So what's their secret?
Their core skill is superior perception and knowledge. This was shown so clearly by their ability to perfectly recall a complex board position, 20-some pieces, after seeing it for just a few seconds. A beginner could only recall maybe 5 or 6.
And that leads directly to the mechanism, the chunking theory, from Simon and Chase in 1973. How did chunking explain this incredible perception?
It says that expertise is about acquiring a massive library of small, meaningful patterns, chunks, of maybe up to 6 pieces.
So a grandmaster isn't seeing 32 individual pieces.
No, they're seeing maybe 5 or 6 meaningful strategic chunks, and these chunks are accessed almost instantly, and once they're recognized, they immediately bring to mind possible moves. It's like a condition in a production system.
So that knowledge retrieval just completely bypasses the need for a massive search.
It does, and the interesting history here is that AI research mostly ignored this psychological finding.
Right, they went down their own path.
Yes. AI focused almost exclusively on search depth and speed, which culminated in the brute force success of Deep Blue E beating a world champion. A huge moment for computer science, but it had relatively little psychological impact. It just reinforced this divide between human knowledge-based expertise and machine search-based computation.
That difference between human knowledge and machine computation brings us to a profound philosophical challenge to the entire enterprise. The Chinese room argument.
This is John Searle's famous 1980 thought experiment, and it's aimed squarely at the strong computational theory of mind, or CTM.
And the core question is?
The core question Searle asked is successfully simulating human intelligence the same thing as actually achieving genuine cognition?
Let's walk through the setup again, just to be clear on the mechanics.
Okay, the setup is a man who only understands English is locked in a room. He receives Chinese symbols as input.
Okay.
Inside the room, he has a massive, comprehensive rule book. That's the program, and it's written in English. And it tells him only how to manipulate the symbols based on their formal properties, their shape, their syntax.
Not their meaning.
Not their meaning. He follows these rules and produces a perfectly coherent string of Chinese symbols as output.
So the system is functionally intelligent. It gives the right output for the given input.
Yes. But the critical claim from Searle is that neither the man nor the rule book nor the room as a whole system understands a single word of Chinese.
Right.
The system has successfully manipulated formal symbols, the syntax, but it has no way of attaching thought, content, or meaning, the semantics, to those symbols. It's just an empty symbol shuffling machine.
So the argument's conclusion is that just manipulating formal symbols, no matter how good the simulation is not enough for real cognition.
Exactly. Real understanding, Searle argues, requires intentionality and mental content. It's a fundamental challenge to the idea that a mind is just a program running on hardware.
It's the ultimate counterpoint. It says you need more than a formal structure. You need semantics, something Searle thought maybe only biology could provide.
That's the argument.
So, if the Chinese room challenges what computation can do, our next entry defines what computation is. This is the formal bedrock of the entire field. The Church-Turing thesis.
Right. So Alonzo Church in 1935 and Alan Turing in 1936, they independently came up with a solution to this long-standing problem in mathematics.
Which was?
Which was to precisely define the informal idea of an effectively calculable function, what you and I would just call an algorithm or an effective procedure.
And there are 2 different proposals were proven to be mathematically equivalent.
Yes. And the thesis basically identifies this informal, intuitive idea with a mathematically precise one. Recursive function computability for Church, and Turing machine computability for Turing.
So this is the formal, agreed-upon definition of what computation is in a mechanical sense.
It is.
Why is that so critical, not just for math, but for cognitive science and AI?
Because it establishes the theoretical boundaries of thought. It was absolutely essential for solving Hilbert's decision problem, the Entscheidungs problem.
Which asked if an algorithm could exist that could determine if any statement in logic was valid.
And the Church-Turing thesis proved that such a general algorithm is uncomputable. It's impossible.
So there are actual logical mechanical limits to what even a perfect mind or a perfect computer could ever do.
Exactly. It allowed for the precise formulation of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and it confirmed that problems like the halting problem, figuring out if a program will ever stop running, are fundamentally unsolvable by any mechanical procedure. If the mind is computational, this thesis defines its ultimate limits.
Having set up the formal limits of computation and the physical basis of the brain, let's see how they interact with our social and linguistic world, starting with code switching.
Code switching is, simply put, the alternating use of two or more codes, so languages or different speech varieties, within the same conversation.
It seems like it could be totally random, but how do researchers analyze something so fluid?
Well, it's far from random. Research really falls into two main camps. You have the syntactic tradition, which focuses on the linguistic rules underlying the form of the code switch.
So where in a sentence can you actually switch?
Exactly. What are the grammatical constraints that make sure the final sentence is still well-formed, even though it's mixing languages?
And the second tradition is pragmatic. It's about the function.
The pragmatic tradition connects that linguistic form to its function in the conversation. Why are you switching codes? Maybe to signal your identity, or to exclude someone, or to emphasize a point. These two traditions show that code switching is a really sophisticated, rule-governed practice, both structurally and socially.
So if code switching looks at language variation in the moment, cognitive anthropology looks at the abstract structures that shape our language over generations.
Right. Cognitive anthropology focuses on three main things:
Mm.
cultural models, cultural universals, and cultural consensus. But let's focus on cultural models, or schemata.
Okay.
These are abstract cognitive structures we have in memory that represent stereotypical concepts, objects, events, actions that are shared within a community.
And these schemata aren't just flat lists of things, are they? They structure knowledge hierarchically.
Yes, exactly. They go from general aspects at the top level down to specific variables at lower levels. And crucially, these schemata and our language are mutually activating. Words and phrases activate specific cultural schemata, which are then expressed through language.
Let's use the commercial event schema example. How does this one schema support all these different linguistic viewpoints?
Okay, so the commercial event schema just abstracts the universal parts of any transaction.
Mhm.
There's a buyer, a seller, some money, some goods, and an exchange.
Right.
A word like buy selects and foregrounds the exchange from the buyer's perspective. It focuses on the goods you get and the money you spend. But a word like charge foregrounds the seller and the money involved. The underlying schema is the same, but different words let us take different perspectives on it.
And beyond events, these models structure relationships in specific ways.
Oh yeah, we see structures like taxonomic, which is kind of relationships, like an oak is a kind of tree,
Hmm.
or partnomic, which is pair-whole relationships, a hand is part of an arm. And then you have metaphorical models, which are everywhere.
Where abstract concepts are understood in terms of concrete ones.
Right, like time is money, or love is a journey. This profoundly shapes our everyday speech. We invest time, we waste money.
That effort to scientifically study these shared thought patterns leads us straight to cognitive archaeology. The whole idea of studying something like ideology with a scientific framework seems almost radical.
It is radical. Cognitive archaeology is sometimes called cognitive processual archaeology, and it tries to study symbol, thought, and ideology within a strict scientific frame of reference.
And the core claim is that these high-level things are just as knowable as, say, diet or tool use.
Exactly. That things like religion and ideology are just as amenable to scientific modeling and study as subsistence and technology.
So what are the material traces they use to try and reconstruct how people thought in the past?
Well, modern approaches really try to focus on human decision-making. This often involves computational modeling.
Like what?
For instance, simulating the cognitive processes of prehistoric flint knappers to understand their planning abilities, or using simulations to model foraging behavior to understand their resource strategies. And a huge part of it is looking at cultural transmission, how social learning affects how artifacts change over long periods of time.
Whether it was a prehistoric axe or a modern spreadsheet, these are tools that fundamentally restructure how we think. Let's talk about cognitive artifacts.
Cognitive artifacts are just external structures. They can be material, like a tool or writing, or they can be mental, like a mnemonic or a rule of thumb. And they coordinate our functional skills into bigger functional systems that help us think.
And the historical impact here is just massive. The shift from oral to literate culture, specifically the invention of writing systems, completely transformed human cognition.
Oh, absolutely. And not just writing words. Think about the invention of maps, graphs, or tabular formats for data like a spreadsheet. These don't just record information, they enable a totally different, higher-order type of reasoning about complex data that would be impossible to hold in your working memory.
And we use these artifacts opportunistically in what's called a situated way. Can you give a few examples of that?
We see it everywhere.
Huh?
Micronesian navigators using the night sky not as decoration, but as a compass and a computational tool to solve navigation problems.
Yeah.
Airline pilots using incidental features on their displays to spot speed deviations rather than doing the math in their head.
Or even the ancient method of loci.
Exactly. Associating parts of a speech with different rooms in a building to help you remember the order. The external structure guides the internal process.
But here's where the concept is often misunderstood. Writing something down and reading it later, that doesn't actually amplify your internal memory.
No, and that's the critical insight from Cole and Griffin. Writing doesn't just expand your memory. It uses a different set of functional skills, reading, visual scanning to get to the same goal. The artifact forces you to reorganize your cognitive functions into a new system.
And the computer is special.
The computer is special because it both reorganizes our cognitive functions and it often mimics our cognitive function.
But there's a warning that comes with using these artifacts, isn't there?
Yes, there's a caveat. The use of artifacts has side effects. The skills you use all the time get sharper, but the skills that are displaced, the ones the artifact handles for you, they can atrophy.
So the concept is really about a category of processes.
Exactly. It's about the processes that produce cognitive effects by coordinating our internal skills with some kind of external structure.
And this reorganization of work and thought is the central concern of our next entry, cognitive ergonomics.
This field is all about the psychological, social, and technological issues that come up in complex technological environments, especially the computerized workplace. The goal is purely practical.
Improving human performance.
Right. By using user-centered design to reorganize our cognitive activities around these advanced tools.
And this field has been critical for developing these foundational models of how we work, like Rasmussen's model from 1983. How does that help us analyze work?
Rasmussen made a distinction between three types of behavior. Skills are automatic, like riding a bike. Rules are automated responses in familiar situations, like following a checklist. And knowledge is that deliberate, explicit planning you need for unfamiliar or unexpected situations.
And that distinction is crucial for designing systems because each type of behavior fails in a different way.
And that leads you directly to James Reason's model of human error.
Okay.
Reason's model identifies those error types precisely. Slips and lapses are attention or memory failures at that low-level skill stage. Mistakes are rule-based or knowledge-based failures, like picking the wrong procedure. And violations are intentional breaches. Understanding this is fundamental for safety in high-stakes fields like aviation.
We also see the influence of Don Norman here with his model of human-computer interaction.
Yeah, Norman modeled that essential loop of execution and evaluation. He focused on bridging two conceptual gaps. The gulf of execution is a difficulty a user have in translating their goal into the actions the system understands.
And the gulf of evaluation.
The gulf of evaluation is the difficulty the user has in figuring out what the system did and whether it actually achieved their goal. Good ergonomic design tries to make both of those gulfs as small as possible.
And finally, cognitive ergonomics uses this ultimate artifact concept, distributed cognition.
Right. This was championed by Edwin Hutchins. And it views the cognitive process as distributed, not locked inside one person's head.
It's in the whole system.
It's in the whole system.
Yeah.
Cognitive processes are spread between human agents and the cognitive artifacts, the tools, the manuals, the instruments in the workplace. He famously showed that an airplane is flown by the cockpit system as a whole, not just by two individual pilots.
So performance is inseparable from the environment and the tools you're using.
Exactly.
Now, having explored how human technology distributes our thinking, let's look at how non-human intelligence, out in the wild, handles complex tasks without those artifacts. This brings us to cognitive ethology.
Cognitive ethology, which was essentially founded by Donald Griffin back in 1976, is the study of animals' mental experiences.
But specifically in their natural environment.
Yes, especially when they're observed in their natural habitat during their daily lives.
What's the rationale for that compared to the strict behaviorism you'd see in a psychology lab?
Well, the core argument is one of evolutionary continuity. Given all the similarities in structure and behavior between animals and humans, Why would we assume they don't have comparable mental experiences?
Right.
And, furthermore, the tasks they need for daily survival foraging, mating, avoiding predators often require cognitive skills that are way more complex and sophisticated than what you can see in a highly controlled lab setting.
And the methodology is about looking for intelligent behavior, especially when an animal faces a new problem.
Exactly. The focus is on finding evidence of flexibility, planning, conscious intent. Classic examples are things like piping plovers using injury feigning to distract a predator, a seemingly intentional act of deception.
Or the vervet monkeys.
Or the famous vervet monkeys, who use distinct calls that carry semantic information. A specific call for a leopard, one for an eagle, one for a snake. It shows reference, not just raw emotion.
Shifting to how our minds organize space, let's talk about cognitive maps.
The term comes from Edward Tolman in 1948. In his classic experiments, he trained rats in a maze to find food. When he blocked their usual path, the rats chose a new, untried path that headed directly toward where the food should be.
So they weren't just following a simple sequence of turns like a strip map. They had an internal representation of the whole environment.
They had acquired a wide, comprehensive map, and the search for the neural basis of this led to the discovery of place cells in the hippocampus.
These are cells that fire only when an animal is in a particular physical location.
That's right.
But if place cells just tell you, I am here, how does the system figure out how to get to B if B is out of sight?
And that's where the computational theories are so important. McNaughton and his colleagues proposed a vector subtraction model. They suggested that the place cells, combined with information about distance and heading from your own movement, are enough to generate a vector, a straight-line path from where you are to the unseen goal.
It solves the wayfinding problem computationally.
Exactly.
We often use the term cognitive map as a metaphor for things like organizations or family trees. Does the underlying neural mechanism actually support that transfer?
Well, that raises a key question, doesn't it? How well does this specialized spatial cognition that evolved for navigating the physical world transfer to these abstract non-spatial domains? The concept is compelling, but the true depth of that transfer is still a major area of research.
Finally, in this section, we move to a domain where physics, biology, and language all meet: color vision.
Color vision is a perfect test case for studying the relationship between a physical stimulus, our neurophysiology, how we categorize things, and that endless debate over linguistic relativity.
The science is pretty well understood.
It is. Our color experience starts with 3 families of cones in our eyes responding to light, and then that signal's processed in terms of opponent processes: red, green, blue, yellow, and black, white.
And the famous debate here is whether our experience of color is totally shaped by the names our language gives them, or if there's some universal biological constraint.
And the seminal work by Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, Basic Color Terms, really settled this by showing strong universal constraints. They found a clear evolutionary sequence across all languages.
So,
If a language has only 2 color terms, they will always correspond to black, dark, and white light. If it has 3, the third one will always be red. And there's a sequence after that, green or yellow, then the other, and so on.
so our biology dictates how we carve up the spectrum.
It strongly suggests that our universal cognitive architecture, which is constrained by our neurophysiology, dictates how languages divide up the color spectrum, regardless of cultural differences.
We return now to the absolute heart of strong cognitive science: computation. What is the central claim of the computational theory of mind, or CTM?
The strong claim, which is sometimes called cognitivism, is that the mind is a computer at an appropriate level of abstraction. It's not just a model of the mind. The mind is fundamentally a computational device.
And within CTM, the most influential definition of computation is formal symbol manipulation. What does that actually mean?
It defines computation as the active manipulation of symbolic ingredients in a way that depends only on their formal properties, their shape, their syntax, and is totally independent of their semantic properties, their meaning.
And that's the key insight.
It's the key insight. If you can design the formal rules to mirror the rules of logic, the system can perform semantically coherent processes by reacting purely to the physical shape of the symbols.
Does this definition clash with other ways the word computation is used?
Oh, it does. You have to recognize the conceptual distinctions. Computation is also used abstractly, like with Turing machines, or in a more quantitative sense, like information processing. In cognitive science, the CTM version often defaults to a fairly narrow view. Serial systems based on fixed, symbolic, high-level representations, like you saw in early GeoF AI.
Good old-fashioned AI. So how does this computation get implemented in the physical world? Let's look at computation and the brain.
The motivation here really comes from two places. First, the idea that the nervous system's function is fundamentally representational. Brain states represent the world, and transitions between them are computations on those representations.
And the second?
The second is drawn from that abstract mathematical definition of computability itself.
And this leads to two competing ideas for how the brain actually computes.
Right. You have the symbolic serial approach,
Right.
which is often about algorithms operating on sentence-like representations.
Yeah.
And then you have the neuroscience parallel approach,
Sure.
which is rooted in how individual neurons integrate signals. And that leads to connectionist models or artificial neural networks.
The utility of these ANNs in neuroscience is pretty striking. How do researchers use them to understand a biological system they can't easily mess with?
It's a critical strategy. They'll train an ANN to perform a specific task that the real brain does. For example, computing the position of a visual stimulus relative to your head. By then analyzing the network's internal structure, researchers can guess what computation is being performed and then suggest actual experiments for the real neural system.
Predicting how real neurons should react.
Exactly.
This need for rigorous analysis brings us to computational learning theory, or CLT.
The whole mission of CLT is formal analysis. It's about proving whether a given learning task is even possible and how efficient the algorithms need to be. The field really comes from L.G. Valiant in 1984, who set out three defining notions for what makes for efficient learning.
What are those three notions?
First, learning has to be probabilistic. It has to tolerate error because your data is always finite and randomly generated.
Yeah.
Second, it must have computational efficiency. The execution time has to be bounded by a polynomial in the sample size. If it takes exponentially longer to learn from a bigger data set, it's not efficient.
And third?
And third, it needs appropriate generality. The hypothesis you come up with has to generalize well to new data you haven't seen. It has to be real learning, not just memorizing the training set.
If even simple problems can be computationally hard and key hard, how does the theory deal with that complexity?
Well, challenges came up early on when simple learning problems like learning perceptrons were shown to be NP hard. The solutions focused on reducing that computational load. Things like introducing query mechanisms, where the algorithm can actively ask for examples to be classified. Or most famously, boosting models, which combine a lot of weak, mediocre hypotheses into a single, very effective, strong one. And that idea has been hugely influential in modern machine learning.
When computation is applied to language, we get computational lexicons.
Right. Traditionally, a lexicon was just a repository of information for a computer program. But modern trends really demand a deeper concern for how lexical types reflect underlying categories about the world, and a much closer integration of semantic operations with the lexical structures themselves.
Why is that integration so important for the theoretical side of things?
Because a fully developed computational lexicon is the most complete working description of a language's base. And more importantly, the architectural decisions you have to make to build one, like using special languages for lexical inheritance, they test whether your abstract theoretical ideas are actually legitimate and useful.
So if your linguistic theory can't be robustly built into a computational lexicon, its utility is in question.
It's seriously questioned, yes.
Now we go back to the brain structure itself, with computational neuroanatomy. How does this differ from Cajal's focus on the single neuron?
It's basically the antithesis of Cajal's particulate approach. Computational neuroanatomy tries to construct a supraneuronal continuum, a field theory. It views the large-scale spatial organization of cells as being computational in its function, not just structural packaging.
So the organization itself is part of the calculation.
The organization is the calculation.
Give us that example from the visual cortex that proves this point.
Okay, so in the visual cortex, models of ocular dominance and orientation columns showed that their physical structure can be generated by applying a spatial filter to white noise. And this analysis made topological predictions about the structure.
What did it predict?
It predicted that the zero crossings of the orientation map should show an alternating handedness of orientation vortices, these little swirls of neural activity. And these predictions were later physically confirmed by optical recording data.
Which demonstrates that the physical architecture is implementing a core part of the visual calculation.
That's right.
And generalizing that processing model, we have computational neuroscience.
This is the application of computational techniques, often ANNs, to study how the brain processes information, how populations of neurons encode and decode data.
And what are the primary models used here?
We rely on feed-forward models, which show how a cortical cell's preference is determined by its inputs, like in the classic Hubel and Wiesel models. But crucially, we also use feedback networks, which are governed by attractor dynamics.
First studied by Hopfield.
Right. Attractor dynamics describe how a system, when it's given incomplete or noisy input, settles into a stable, consistent state.
Like how your brain recognizes a face from just a quick glimpse.
Exactly. And these dynamics are critical for things like amplifying signals, suppressing noise, and performing gain control in the brain.
Bringing this thread back to philosophy, let's revisit the computational theory of mind, CTM. If the Chinese room argument says we need more than syntax, how does CTM defend itself?
Well, CTM defends itself by solving what's called the causal problem. It argues that the system can carry out semantically coherent inferences, logical thought, without needing an inner conscious agent, a homunculus, to understand the meaning.
How does it pull off that formal trick?
It does it through a precise two-part linkage. First, formalization links semantics to syntax. The rules are designed so that manipulating the symbol's shape, the syntax tracks only semantically valid moves.
Okay. And second?
Second, physics links syntax to causation. The computer's hardware physically reacts to the shape of the symbols. So a physical system, the brain or a computer, can carry out valid inferences by reacting only to the formal structure of the representations, because that structure has been designed to track the meaning.
And this framework is also necessary to explain the generative power of human thought.
Yes, that's the principle of compositionality. CTM explains how we can generate a potentially infinite number of new thoughts from a finite set of mental elements, much like Chomsky linguistics explains the productivity of language.
The ability to combine known symbols to form totally new, meaningful thoughts. It's a powerful argument for a symbolic CTM.
It is.
Now let's look at the elements being composed. Concepts. The way we model concepts has really shifted dramatically away from that initial classical view.
Oh yeah. In lexical semantics, we moved away from the classical model, which assumed concepts were defined by a list of necessary and sufficient attributes.
And that model fails.
It largely failed because most everyday terms just don't have clear, expressible definitions. And people routinely list non-necessary features, like birds can fly, even though a penguin is still a bird.
So we move to the more flexible prototype model.
In the prototype model, concepts are represented by a prototype, a sort of bundle of the most common attributes. Categorization then just depends on similarity to that prototype, which naturally explains why we use non-defining features and why category borders can be fuzzy.
And this framework includes the theory of basic levels.
Yes, the idea that there's a most common high-frequency level of categorization that maximizes distinctiveness, like chair, instead of the superordinate furniture or the subordinate recliner.
Finally, let's turn to conceptual change itself, how these structures evolve over time. And this happens on a pretty profound continuum, doesn't it?
It does. Conceptual change is any shift in a conceptual structure or how it's used. On the minimal end, you have feature or property changes, which are just incremental shifts. You're just tuning the parameters, like weighting texture more than shape when you're classifying a towel.
But the really revolutionary shifts are the theoretic changes.
Theoretic changes are these dramatic, qualitative restructurings of whole systems of related concepts. Concepts are seen as embedded in these larger theories. This is the highly influential idea from Thomas Kuhn and Susan Carey that change involves overcoming anomalies in an older theory, leading to a complete reorganization of how we understand a whole domain.
Like shifting from Newtonian physics to relativity.
Exactly. Or in psychology, shifting from behaviorism to cognitivism. It's the difference between updating the features of a program and changing the entire operating system of your knowledge.
A huge difference.
It is. And the source also mentions usage changes, where the concepts themselves don't change much, but you have a radical shift in how they're applied, a different way of using the same knowledge.
If concepts are the knowledge, conditioning is one of the foundational mechanisms by which we learn the relationships between them.
Right. Conditioning is the study of how organisms learn about causal relationships in the world, as Rescorla famously defined it. And we distinguish between the two classic types.
First, Pavlovian conditioning, which is all about the contingency between stimuli.
Correct. The reinforcement, the unconditioned stimulus, is contingent on another stimulus, the conditioned stimulus. The idea is that the CS presentation activates a mental representation of the US.
And then you have instrumental conditioning.
In instrumental conditioning, the reinforcement depends on a designated response. So the response itself is modified by its consequences. That's Thorndike's law of effect.
The theoretical significance for cognitive science, and especially for AI, is that the Rescorla-Wagner model of Pavlovian conditioning is structurally identical to the delta rule used in those parallel distributed processing networks.
That connection is absolutely critical. The delta rule, or the Widrohoff rule, is what determines the change in connection weights in a network. And it's basically a mathematical description of learning only when you're surprised.
Right.
Learning only happens to reduce the discrepancy between what you expected to happen and what actually happened.
And this explains that classic conditioning phenomenon of blocking.
Blocking is when, if one stimulus, CS1, already reliably predicts an outcome, and then you add a second stimulus, CS2, you get little or no conditioning to CS2. The Rescorla-Wagner model explains it perfectly. Since CS1 already accounts for the expected outcome, the prediction error is basically zero. There's no surprise left for CS2 to reduce, so there's nothing to learn about. It's a really clear illustration of error reduction driving learning.
Moving from the behavior to the actual brain, let's look at conditioning and the brain. Where do these simple learned associations physically happen?
Well, we look at specific, evolutionarily old learned responses. For learned fear, that develops really rapidly, and it involves the amygdala. If that fear is context-dependent, say you only fear something in a specific room, it also involves the hippocampus for a limited time.
And that's characteristic of declarative memory.
Exactly. And the most precise motor skill learned through conditioning is the eye blink response.
An elementary, precisely timed motor skill.
It is. And it exhibits all the basic conditioning laws. And two brain systems are massively engaged. The cerebellum controls the precise timing of the learned motor skill, and the hippocampus is crucial during the acquisition phase.
Also,
Hippocampal activity is an invariable and strongly predictive correlate of the subsequent behavioral learning. It forms a kind of temporal model of the learned response that's necessary to fine-tune the motor output.
now let's apply that neural network concept directly to language with connectionist approaches to language.
The connectionist view models cognition through the spreading activation of simple units, distributed processing. And crucially, these networks lack the architecture of traditional symbolic models.
Meaning no task-specific modules, no discrete symbols, no explicit rules.
Right.
So how do they represent complex linguistic information if they don't have symbols?
They use distributed representations. Information is encoded not in one single place, but across many nodes and connections at the same time. This means they inherently lack that explicit language-like syntactic structure you see in traditional models.
And this approach has been central to the debate over nativism.
It has. It's been used to argue that models that don't have grammatical knowledge built in can still acquire complex grammatical competence just through exposure to data.
And how do they handle the complexity of language flow?
They hypothesize something called parallel modularity. Instead of information flowing through serial stages, syntax first, then semantics, they assume that different modules like phonological or semantic subnetworks all operate in parallel and continuously exchange information.
Which is a sharp contrast to the pipeline approach of symbolic CTM.
A very sharp contrast.
This exploration of distributed non-symbolic systems brings us to maybe the biggest challenge in all of cognitive science: consciousness.
Philosophically, consciousness is defined by the hard problem. Why should there be something that it is like to undergo certain physical processes? This subjective, qualitative aspect of experience is what Joseph Allein called the explanatory gap.
The early philosophical view was central state materialism, that conscious experience is identical with brain processes, but that was heavily challenged.
It was, by arguments like Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat, which suggested our grasp of subjective facts is independent of physical theory. So efforts at demystification, like from Daniel Dennett, try to show the unclarities in the subjective character of experience itself.
While Paul Churchland tries to provide neural explanations.
Right, he tries to explain the structural features of experience, like why orange feels closer to red than to blue, by mapping them onto a neural coding space.
But the distinction we use most often today is Ned Block's separation of P and A consciousness.
Phenomenal P consciousness is that subjective experience, the raw what it's like. Access A. Consciousness is when the content is available for reasoning, for rational control of action and speech.
And they seem independent.
They do. And ignored background noise is P consciousness without A consciousness. Conversely, the philosophical idea of superblind sight would be A consciousness, the ability to report on something without the subjective P consciousness.
And how does the philosopher John Searle connect consciousness back to intentional thought?
Searle, arguing from his Chinese room premise, proposed the connection principle. It says that unconscious intentional phenomena must be, in principle, accessible to consciousness.
So it suggests a deep link between intentionality and P-consciousness.
A very deep link. Thoughts, even if they're unconscious right now, must be the kind of thing that could become phenomenally conscious.
And the physical investigation of all this is the neurobiology of consciousness.
A lot of this work relies on the dual stream hypothesis. The dorsal stream, from V1 to the parietal cortex, is thought to be associated with unconscious online systems used for immediate action control.
And the ventral stream.
The ventral stream is thought to be related to conscious perception, synthesizing information from many sources for planning over longer time horizons.
What's the most direct physical evidence we have for correlating neural activity with a subjective conscious perception?
The research on binocular rivalry is key here. When a monkey is shown a different image to each eye, its subjective perception flips back and forth. By monitoring neural activity in the early visual cortex, researchers have shown that the neural activity reliably reflects the animal's subjective percept. The moment the animal reports seeing image A, the corresponding neural activity for A appears.
It provides physical correlates for the subjective experience itself.
Exactly.
Let's end this part with a formal AI problem that is essential to modeling cognition. Constraint satisfaction, or CS.
CS is a fundamental problem framework. It's defined by a set of variables, their possible values, and a set of constraints that restrict the legal combinations of those values.
These problems, like graph coloring or satisfiability, are used to model mundane cognitive tasks.
They are things like vision, language comprehension, default reasoning, but they're generally NP hard, which means they get computationally intractable very, very quickly.
So if they're intractable, we need sophisticated algorithms to make them feasible. What are the two main approaches?
We use search, like systematic backtracking, and consistency inference, which is often called constraint propagation. Consistency inference algorithms, like arc consistency, try to derive new explicit constraints to transform the whole problem into an equivalent but easier to solve form before you even start the search.
That sounds like a trade-off.
It is a constant trade-off. You're balancing the computational effort you spend on inference making the problem simpler against the effort you spend on the search itself. And modern approaches also improve the search with techniques like backjumping, where you analyze why a choice led to a dead end, and constraint learning, where you record those dead ends as new rules to avoid making the same mistake again.
Let's shift back to language and look at how our position in the world shapes what we say. That's the essence of context and point of view.
Right. The literal meaning of most linguistic expressions depends fundamentally on the context of the utterance. This is primarily captured by indexicals or deixis.
These are expressions whose reference is determined by the situation. I means the speaker, here means the location, now means the time.
Exactly. And we use three major kinds: person, spatial, and temporal deixis. But perspective isn't always anchored to the actual speaker, which is where it gets really interesting.
No, speakers shift context all the time.
They do. It's called relativized deixis. You might adopt the hearer's perspective for efficiency, telling someone to press the button to your left. Or you use a map to establish context, pointing to a city and saying, "We took this road right here."
And this idea of flexible perspective is beautifully reflected in narrative style through something called free indirect speech.
Free indirect speech is a coherent shift in a narrative where some deictic parameters are shifted to reflect a character's viewpoint, even while the narrator is speaking.
Give me an example.
If a narrator writes, "Mary looked out the window, her husband was coming soon," the adverb soon describes an event happening shortly after that scene, reflecting Mary's time perspective, not the narrator's time of utterance.
It seamlessly blends the narrator's tense with the character's internal viewpoint.
That's right.
Moving from narrative control to system control, we have control theory.
Control theory is the engineering discipline focused on designing systems that maintain a desired state, that's regulation, like a thermostat, or follow a desired path, that's tracking, like guiding a missile.
And this is achieved through continuous feedback signals.
Exactly, from an auxiliary system called a compensator or controller.
Linear systems are the models, but most real-world applications, especially complex biological systems like walking or breathing, they require nonlinear models.
Precisely. And a major mathematical triumph in this field is the Kalman-Busse filter. This is a powerful, recursive algorithm used everywhere.
From guidance systems for spacecraft to driverless cars?
Exactly. It's used to effectively reduce the effects of measurement error in systems that are inherently influenced by random noise or stochastics. It's a cornerstone of robust system control.
Now let's talk about a major social system dynamic. Cooperation and competition. This is an evolutionary paradox because it requires an explanation for altruism.
The paradox is simple, right? Social groups rely on cooperation, but individuals and their genes are in constant competition. So this demands evolutionary mechanisms that can explain altruism behavior that benefits another at a potential cost to yourself.
The source outlines 3 established evolutionary mechanisms for how altruism can emerge.
First, there's mutualism, where both individuals gain an immediate advantage from the cooperative act, like huddling together for warmth.
Okay.
Second, reciprocal altruism, where the debt is repaid at some future time during the altruist's life, like forming a coalition to share resources. And third, kin selection, where the debt is repaid through the recipient's survival, which contributes to the altruist's inclusive fitness.
And that only works when you're genetically related.
Right. It ensures your shared genes survive.
But cooperation is inherently unstable because of the free rider problem. How does game theory address this instability?
The tendency for individuals to cheat, to take the benefits without paying the cost, is that powerful tragedy of the commons. Game theory, especially through simulations of the prisoner's dilemma, looked for stable strategies.
And the most successful one was tit for tat.
Tit for tat, TFT. Cooperate on the first move, and then just mirror what your opponent did on their last move. Its simplicity and its retaliatory nature make it highly stable.
What's truly fascinating here is the finding from the Watson selection task, which suggests our cognitive adaptations for social exchange are specialized.
That's one of the deepest insights into human social cognition. When you give people the task in its abstract logical form, if P then Q, they often fail.
But when you give them the logically equivalent social contract version,
like checking if a person drinking beer is over 21, they consistently get it right. This strongly suggests our minds have cognitive adaptations that are specifically evolved to solve problems of social exchange and to detect cheating.
we are biologically wired to be social contract experts.
It seems so.
Shifting to individual accomplishment, let's look at creativity.
Well, the modern study of creativity moved past early associations with madness or genetics and really began with researchers like Guilford, who developed tests for fluency and originality, like the famous Brick Uses test.
But the core insight, detailed by Wallace, is that creation is a recursive process, not just a sudden flash of insight. What are those stages?
Wallace described 4 recursive stages. First, preparation. Just deep immersion in a domain, acquiring that deep knowledge base, often with a sense of unresolved curiosity.
Then incubation.
Second, incubation. This is mental work that's happening below the threshold of consciousness, allowing for non-rational associations that our conscious thought often shuts down.
Then you have illumination, the aha moment.
Right. And then the 4th stage is verification or elaboration. This is the 99% perspiration phase, translating that insight into reality, which often involves huge changes as the idea evolves into a concrete product.
And the source insists on a systemic view of creativity, which sounds like it expands Wallace's model beyond just the individual.
It does. It views creativity as a confluence of 3 factors: the domain, the rules and practices like painting, the individual, who makes the new variation, and the field, the experts and gatekeepers who decide what variation is worth adding to the domain.
So a lack of creativity might not be the individual's fault.
It could be due to the domain being exhausted or the field just not recognizing a new idea.
From individual creation to collective linguistic creation, creoles.
Creoles are these unique language groups that arise from intense contact between speakers of unrelated languages, often during European colonialism. They have no clear proto-language affiliation, and they typically start as simplified pidgins.
The most influential theory here is Bickerton's bioprogram theory. How does that connect creoles to a universal cognitive structure?
Bickerton proposed that creoles reflect language universals more directly than normal languages. He argued this happens because they arise when children are trying to acquire a language from input, the pidgin, that is really reduced and deformed.
So the children have to fill in the gaps.
They use an innate, species-specific biological program to fill in those morphological gaps, creating new grammatical features in a single generation. And data from the Hawaiian Pidgin Creole cycle strongly supports this theory.
But there are competing theories about where Creole grammar comes from.
Yes, 3 main alternatives. Substratism argues the syntax comes from the non-European languages spoken by the ancestors. Superstratism claims the syntax comes from colloquial versions of the European language.
And the third?
And the confidential approach just suggests it's a mix, that different creoles draw different amounts from substratal, superstratal, and universal sources.
We touched on cultural consensus before. Let's delve a bit deeper into its methodology with cultural consensus theory.
This statistical model is designed to measure shared cultural knowledge among a group of people. And crucially, it estimates both an individual's competence and the culturally correct answer without the researcher needing an answer key ahead of time.
What are the necessary assumptions for that statistical model to work?
It rests on three core assumptions. Common truth, that a fixed answer key exists. Local independence, that responses are independent of each other given the correct answer. And homogeneity of items, that an individual's competence is the same across all questions.
So it assumes the only reason people agree is because they're both tapping into the same shared information.
Exactly, and by assuming that, the model can extract the consensus and rank everyone's individual competence.
This brings us to a macro-level concept that informs all cultural studies: cultural evolution.
Cultural evolution looks at cultural changes in knowledge and beliefs that result from universal properties of human minds, assuming other constraints are equal. It asks how culture arose, and most importantly, how cultural representations are constrained by our human genotype.
And these cognitive constraints are key to understanding what makes a cultural concept successful, what makes it stick.
Right. Humans develop a universal conceptual structure, an intuitive ontology that constrains transmission. Things like an innate theory of mind or a perception of mechanical causation.
And cultural symbolism often works by playing with these concepts.
It combines these intuitive concepts in a few counterintuitive ways. For instance, a superhuman agent that has the intuitive property of agency, but the counterintuitive property of being non-material. And these counterintuitive concepts are highly successful because they are few in number and extremely memorable.
This feeds directly into cultural psychology.
Cultural psychology is the study of how the human mind is transformed and shaped by the cultural communities we live in. They have a great slogan for this.
Which is?
Universalism without the uniformity. They acknowledge that our fundamental cognitive architecture is universal, but that diverse social environments and cultural models play these crucial mediating roles that lead to non-trivial cognitive differences.
And finally, a concept often treated as a false dichotomy in this field: cultural relativism.
Cognitive anthropology really just rejects the strict relativist versus universalist dichotomy. While our basic cognitive architecture is universal, the process is mediated by cultural models that have what Roy D'Andrade called a double life.
What does that mean?
They exist as instituted models out in the world, in public institutions and forms, and then they become internalized as conventional mental models in our individual minds.
And this mediation means that the resulting cultural variation, especially the variation within a culture, is patterned according to social structure and expertise.
Exactly.
So intercultural variation, the differences inside a group, isn't just noise, it's functional structure.
That's right. Traditional ethnography assumed everyone in a group was the same, but that was rejected as totally unrealistic. Variation reflects the division of labor, kin groups, individual expertise, and studies show that the people who align with the consensus model are predictably more reliable and experienced in that specific domain.
This has been a deeply detailed inventory of the C section of the cognitive sciences, providing a complete systems view.
You know, what's so fascinating is the complete picture the C entries construct. We started with the smallest possible unit, that discrete neuron, defined by Cajal, and the largest abstract limit of thought, the Church-Turing thesis.
And then we built up the systems.
We built up the systems. From simple associative learning and conditioning to the complex concepts of categorization, which are themselves shaped by external systems, our tools, our cognitive artifacts, and our society, with cooperation and cultural evolution.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means cognitive science truly requires this holistic, deeply interdisciplinary view. You can't just talk about memory without considering the computational limits of the system or the social context that demands specialized reasoning. Everything is connected.
Here's a provocative thought for you to mull over.
Huh.
We saw that the complexity of human social interaction, the need to detect cheating, seems to have led to specialized, powerful cognitive adaptations. our minds seem well adapted for complex, face-to-face social contracts.
Right.
So what entirely novel cognitive adaptations might be emerging right now as we increasingly live and operate inside the distributed computational cognitive systems of the modern computerized workplace and the broader digital culture?
An excellent question to end on. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this has provided you with a thorough and engaging introduction to the C section of the cognitive sciences, giving you a comprehensive shortcut to being well informed.